Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you on a matter that I feel is actually an incredibly important one in science education. Working in a subtle or apparently harmless way, but nevertheless dangerous or deadly, an insidious virus, for example, an ambush. That's why I entitled the talk Insidious Creationism. And I've said that it is a form of intellectual abuse. And that's not a charge that I'm going to lay down frivolously. Often intellectual abuse is characterized by the ridiculing of children, calling them stupid, laughing at their silly answers to questions, for example. If you were in the schools in the 1950s and 60s, you'll remember those scornful, nasty, hateful teachers that wouldn't actually let you think for yourself, but said, you're not here to learn. Sorry, you're not here to know and to understand. You're here to learn. I talk and you listen. But it's not just teachers that can be guilty of that sort of intellectual abuse. Parents can also be guilty. And so can those in a community who have positions of power, responsibility, and authority. What I intend to sort of show here today is really an intellectual abuse of children by the creationist community. They use the power and the authority of the evangelical church or the ministry, and in doing so, they implant scientific misconceptions. And those misconceptions, as I will show today, are actually very difficult to change, no matter how good a science teacher you are, no matter how thorough a science education you provide. So, what do I mean by intellectual abuse? I've mentioned it's about the attacking and the ridiculing of the thinking of a child. It's about preventing a child from thinking for themselves. It's presenting yourself, perhaps, as perfect or always being right, having no doubts, no uncertainties. Now, intellectual abuse, therefore, is something which I think we should all take incredibly seriously. But why am I applying this to what is really a very small minority of people, the creationist community? They're not very large in the UK, but they have a very large voice. They are much, much larger in America, for example. Well, this is why I apply the term intellectual abuse to creationism. I feel that when a person in a position of power and authority who claims expertise in science deliberately provides a non-scientific explanation for a natural phenomenon, knowing that to be at odds with the accepted scientific explanation, then that person is guilty of intellectual abuse. Now, interestingly, I've studied creationism for the past 30 years. I was introduced to it as an undergraduate. I studied geology at the University of London, at Goldsmiths College. And during those studies, I was taken along by one of my fellow undergraduates to their church, the Metropolitan Tabernacle at Elephant and Castle. There, I was asked, how could you, a scientist, actually subscribe to a racist, evil, and dangerous theory, this thing that we call evolution? I quickly found out that my invitation to the Tabernacle was no accident. It was very deliberate indeed. I was given materials to take away, which included a book called Ape Men, Fact or Fallacy, by a gentleman called Malcolm Bowden. I was given leaflets, and very interestingly, we had a very good, elegant exposition this morning from Professor Dawkins about what is the second law of thermodynamics. And I'll be honest with you, when I first heard that argument from the creationist community, it had me stumped. I wasn't studying thermodynamics. I didn't really understand thermodynamics. And so they hit me with it. And I thought, they might have a point. I asked a friend of mine who was a physics undergraduate, what do you think? And he said, I don't know. But eventually we hit on, obviously, the flaw, which is that they only ever give you the first part of the second law, and they omit the little bit about open and closed systems. So we breathed a sigh of relief. Now, of course, the creationist community will say to you that we don't want to remove evolution from the curriculum. curriculum. We just want a fair, balanced treatment. Talking about evolution is no different from saying arguing for or against nuclear power, for and against genetic modification, for and against cloning. We don't want to get rid of evolution. It has its place. We just demand balanced treatment and fair time. Well, interestingly, they can't have that. And they can't have it for the very simple reason that in schools, in science, we teach science, not pseudoscience. They will tell you that creationism, intelligent design theory, for example, and I use the word theory very, very loosely, in the vernacular sense, not in the scientific sense. They will tell you that intelligent design creationism, although they always drop the creationism bit off, they will tell you that intelligent design should be taught in a school. But what is intelligent design? It basically states that if we can't explain something, then we say it clearly must have been designed. Well, I'm sorry, I don't go along with that. Intelligent design explains nothing. Science fails to proceed if that's the approach that we take. Science succeeds where there are things that we do not know, that we do not understand. And the role of science is to find those explanations for natural phenomena. I can't actually see Oxford or Cambridge in the near future offering degrees in supernatural sciences. I can't see somebody going for a science PhD saying, well, I've done the tests, I've investigated, I've read all the papers, I haven't got a clue what's going on, so therefore my answer is, it was designed, could I have my doctorate, please? Even their arguments for and against don't actually hold any water, because let's examine that argument. For and against nuclear power, we're not arguing as to whether or not radiation exists, whether or not radiation is dangerous. In genetic modification, we're not arguing that things can be genetically modified or cannot be genetically modified. But in evolution, they want to argue that evolution does exist, and on the other hand, it doesn't. Now, there are controversies in evolution. Phyletic gradualism and punctuated equilibrium, for example. There are arguments going on. Is it really one or the other? Now, that's a controversy, perhaps, that we could talk about in school science, but not whether or not evolution actually happens, as has been stated. Evolution is a fact. The theory of evolution by means of natural selection is a theory. Well, over the years, I've collected creationist books and materials. And the creationists produced some very appealing books, some very appealing comics, and some very appealing literature. They do mix real science with pseudoscience. And that's one of the tactics of trying to get creationism into the classroom. They play with the notion of truth versus accuracy. They will say something that is actually accurate, or they'll take a quotation from a scientific paper that is accurate, but it actually does not convey the truth of what that quotation was actually all about. And they certainly will emphasize aspects of the scientific evidence for evolution, but they'll put onto it a creationist interpretation. Thereby they don the mantle of science to cover up the pseudoscience of creationism. And of course, they will just bury and ignore the evidence that doesn't fit the creation model. They just say it does not exist. The number of creationists who say transition fossils do not exist, there are no such things as transition fossils. They've obviously never walked into the Natural History Museum in London, or any natural history museum. So what do they actually produce? Well, of course, I don't know if you realise it, but the last living pterosaur was captured by cowboys in the 19th century. Now that comes from this particular book called Dinosaurs by Design by Duane T. Gish. He's a very famous creationist. You probably will know about him. I'll say it again. The last living pterosaur was captured by cowboys. And, of course, to show this, in the book, now, be careful here, Gish doesn't claim it's true. He says, that, okay, it's a fanciful idea, but that's the picture from the book. Now, children actually tend to take on board pictures and images much more so than the text that surrounds it. I was struck by how close that was to the film that I loved when I was a young boy, which was a wonderful film in 1969 called Valley of the Gwangi. It upset me, that film, because actually I wanted to be a geologist. And in the film, the geologist gets killed. And it almost turned me off a career in geology, I can tell you. But isn't that interesting? This was 1969. That book, actually, was discovered in the school library by a colleague of mine, an English lecturer at Sussex University. Her daughter had brought it home from her primary school library. This is a state primary school. She flicked through it and suddenly saw images of dinosaurs and people and Noah's Ark and various other images. I thought, how on earth did this get into my child's school library? Now, the school, in fairness to them, when they were contacted, immediately took the book out of the school library. I think it was just a parent had donated the book very generously, along with very other generous donations. But of course, it is a tactic to get this material into schools. Well, here's some other bits and pieces from Dinosaurs by Design. Here we have a lovely picture of the bombardier beetle. And notice at the back end of the bombardier beetle, we have this sort of explosive, fiery emanation, I suppose. I don't know what you call it. Now, Dwayne Gish actually says, well, of course, we've heard about dragons, haven't we? And George and the dragon and the fire-breathing dragons. Well, here's a plausible mechanism by which hadrosaurs, who have these crests with chambers where these chemicals could be mixed, could actually spurt out fire. So perhaps, children, it's not so far from the truth that once there did exist fire-breathing dragons. This is what the bombardier beetle actually does when it sprays its very nasty chemical mix. It is an exceptionally hot chemical mix at 212 degrees, but it is by no means on fire, as the illustration would show you. And this image actually comes from a paper written by Professor Andy McIntosh, who is a creationist himself, and he is a professor of thermodynamics in Leeds, and yet, interestingly, I don't think he's complained about the abuse of his scientific work in the creationist community. Well, here are some of the books. For adults, you can see on the left, Evolution, the Fossils Say No, Dwayne T. Gish again. I was very amused when I walked in this morning and saw the first poster that said, Evolution, the Fossils Say Yes. But on the right-hand side, you can see some examples of some of the books, very attractive to children. Here's a very old creationist tract. It's what's known as a Chick tract. There's a gentleman in America called Jack Chick, and he produces these evangelical tracts, little cartoons. This I picked up in Brighton last year from a table where an evangelical church was trying to get more people to come into his ministry. But look at this here. Only 2.9 million years old. Leakey found a normal human skull under a layer of rock dated 212 million years. Now, that is completely and utterly untrue. The author of this tract has been told that time and time and time again. And yet, this is still being given out in evangelical churches by the creationist community. Now, if that is not intellectually dishonest, I do not know what is. It's not just that we have books. There are websites devoted now to children and creationism. This is Answers in Genesis, kids' website. Kids' Answers. Bugs everywhere. And if you read the text, I know it's far too small on here, but you will see the word design coming through quite prominently in a number of these places. You also then have things like the poster here, which I'll show you the bottom bit very shortly. But hey kids, Buddy Davis here. I love learning new things about dinosaurs. But remember, the Bible is the only eyewitness account of what happened in the past. It was written by the one who was there in the beginning, God. Now, I can't think of any theologian who actually thought that actually just one person wrote the Bible. That's one thing. But of course, it's very subtle and it is dangerous. That's the bottom of the poster. On the left-hand side, you may have heard this story about how a dinosaur got caught, died, and became fossilized. On the right-hand side is not the story, but the truth. But of course, what is it supported by? Only quotations from the Bible. No scientific evidence is supporting that story on the right-hand side, as opposed to the scientific truth, which is on the left-hand side. So these are the sorts of materials that are regularly being given away to children in the creationist community. They are what I call educationally deceitful books. They're not just, harmless, a bit of fun, oh, well, hey, never mind. They are educationally deceitful. Well, why do I get so upset about this? I've witnessed intellectual abuse of children. I go to a number of creationist meetings. I feel that if I'm going to argue against creationism, then I really have got to understand where they are coming from, what their arguments actually are. I went to a church in Banstead, in Surrey, and I heard Dr. Carl Weiland from Answers in Genesis. And he told the story about the fact that he was a medical doctor and surgeon. Okay, he's established his credibility as a scientist. He was a minister of the church. He's established his authority in the church. The meeting took place in a school, not in a church. He then told them about the story of Adam and Eve and how actually, scientifically and medically, a rib can actually regrow. And he's actually correct, they can. But only if not the whole rib has been taken and if the membrane that surrounds it, called the periosteum, is left behind. He had been involved in a very serious car accident. A part of his rib had been taken and the bone had been used to repair his skull. His cranium had been crushed in this car accident. Now, I looked it up, and he's perfectly correct. That can happen. The rib can regrow, and the process he went through was known as a split rib cranioplasty. So, he said, why is it so fanciful to believe that Eve has come from Adam's rib? I have given you the science. Now, okay, that was quite funny, but what really upset me was when he then said to the children, gathered in front of him, looking up at him, dinosaurs were present in the Garden of Eden. All dinosaurs were vegetarian before the fall, including T-Rex, because the dentition of T-Rex could eat fruit. Adam was the first person ever to see a dinosaur. The dinosaurs were described in the Bible. They are the behemoth and the leviathan. And dinosaurs are also probably familiar to people throughout recorded history as sea serpents, dragons, and monsters. So, what are those books? There they are. The Great Dinosaur Mystery and the Bible. Dinosaurs of Eden. Isn't it interesting how Adam and Eve are white, middle class, and I don't know where the hairdresser came from, but they got lovely sort of hair. Anyway, there we go. Now, you may think that's possibly the worst of it. This is my absolute favourite photograph. I don't know about you, but I think that raptor is looking decidedly uncomfortable. But it doesn't just stop there. It isn't just these books. They have a whole series of creation comics, Dinosaurs and Dragons. I've mentioned that previously, here's Gish, he's got a plausible mechanism, for how dinosaurs perhaps could breathe fire. And here's the story again. We have George slaying the dragon. Now, as I say, I studied geology. Paleontology was my specialism during my geology degree. And I think I'm right in saying that what we have here is a Stegosaurus. And I think that the Stegosaurus was actually vegetarian and actually didn't move very fast. So what on earth St. George was worried about with the Stegosaurus, I really don't know. Why he had to go around slaughtering it, I don't know. And I can't see on earth why it would be breathing fire. Actually, that's blood. I thought it was fire at first, but it's not. Apparently it's blood. And of course, being Welsh, I seriously object to them characterising my home flag as being evidence for creation, and that dinosaurs actually were the dragons. But well, how do they attract children? What do they do? Well, actually, you may be interested to know that it isn't just America that has a creationist museum. We do, in fact, have our own creationist museum here. And our museum is in Portsmouth. It's called Genesis Expo. Now, you find me a child that doesn't enjoy dinosaurs, I'll find you a very strange child indeed. This is Genesis Expo. You can find out about the origin of the universe, life and mankind. You can see genuine dinosaur eggs. You can meet Boris, the 20-foot dinosaur, and you can buy books, tapes, and videos. And inside, there's Boris. Fantastic. Lovely table full of rocks, fossils, and minerals, and a huge store of books. And children are actively dragging their parents into this museum off the street. And the parents don't realise it's creationist. None of the fossils have any dates on them. Is it our own fault? Is actually part of this our own fault? I don't know about you, but as a child, I certainly remember the film 1 Million Years BC. And here's a lovely fur-lined, bikini-clad Raquel Welch. And of course, in that film, what was she doing? And what were the cave people doing? They were fighting dinosaurs. And nobody seemed to question it. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle brought us The Lost World. And in fact, we were even reminded of Professor Challenger earlier on today. But it's not just that. We have Barney the dinosaur and children. And we have the Flintstones. So actually, we're socially adjusted to actually think about humans and dinosaurs coexisting without putting too much thought into it. And the creationist actually likes this, and they approve of it. But the issue here is a very serious one. It's about misconceptions. When something a person knows and believes doesn't match what is scientifically correct, that is a misconception. People who hold misconceptions often don't know that they're incorrect. There are lots of misconceptions in everyday life. Heavier things fall faster than lighter things. We see with our eyes. Those are two common misconceptions. Misconceptions are difficult to change. Ask any science teacher. It's incredibly difficult to change a misconception once it's implanted, once it's there. And actually, they can hold misconceptions through examinations. They say, well, I know I've got to give this answer to the examiner because that's the answer I've been told by my teacher, but I know that it's not true. I still believe that X or Y. The earlier misconceptions are established, the more persistent they are. That's clear. The research shows that. There's no bone of contention there. The more difficult they are also to remove. You won't remove them through very simple science teaching in the secondary school. Professor Michael Rice, who resigned as the director of the Royal Society, a friend of mine, he says, okay, I'm not going to think of creationism as a misconception now. It really is a worldview. I disagree with him. The misconceptions arise from a worldview. The difficulty is, the earlier the misconceptions placed, the more difficult it is to remove and challenge. So what is it that we actually have to do in science education? Well, to begin with, I think we have a duty to provide far better and more up-to-date examples of evolution. As I walked out in the foyer area during the break, I noticed the plaster cast of the linear transition of the horse from early to modern horse. The creationists attack it, and with some justification, because it isn't a nice straight linear. That's a model for how horses have evolved. It isn't the actuality of how they actually evolved. They attack the peppered moth, which we're still using in the textbooks. That's a really good example of natural selection in action, but they say, but you say it's evolution, and we say it isn't. It's natural selection. A creationist accepts natural selection. They've had to. It's indisputable. There's a mountain of evidence for it. But what they say is it doesn't account for the change, for example, from land animals to whales or dinosaurs to birds. Those examples are not in the textbooks, and they should be. We must begin evolution education in primary schools. Leaving it until a child is 14 or 15 years of age is far too late. The misconception has been implanted. The misconception has been around for a long time. The child has fitted the evidence that comes to them within their framework of a misconceived idea. Science teachers have got to be given information that allows them to combat creationist challenges in the science classroom. You can't say, you can't talk about it. You can't say, we will not discuss creationism in this lesson. I would never have a science teacher that I've trained actively bring it up in a science lesson. But you have to be reactive when the challenge will come. And the research evidence shows that nearly 50% of science teachers are challenged about evolution versus creationism in the science classroom. The problem is that, like the naive self 30-odd years ago, the creationist challenges are very clever. They are very subtle. And when you hit a science teacher with some of these in a field that they're not familiar with, they don't know how to deal with it. And the creationist turns around and says, we win by default. You can't answer the question, therefore what we say is true. Well, okay, philosophically that's an empty argument anyway. It's wrong. Disproving one thing of evolution does not prove creation. And we have to stop using the language of design in our technical and peer-reviewed science papers. There was an example last year where somebody was talking about the cells of the eye, the Muller cells in the eye, and said that those cells had been ingeniously designed to catch light and transmit it through to another layer. Now, just by using those words, ingeniously designed, the creationist community said, see, here's a scientific example of design in action. And I'm sure that the author didn't mean to imply that there was a designer somewhere designing Muller cells in the eye and checking out to make sure that they could actually catch the right sort of light. It's sloppy language. We heard this morning about, the word theory. Well, that's the subject of the research I'm currently doing with graduates, and it is appalling. They do not understand. These are science graduates. They do not understand the difference between a theory, a hypothesis, a fact, and a law. They don't know how they relate together. Their understanding of the nature of science is poor. Now, theory has a vernacular meaning. It's a speculative guess. I've got a theory, says Inspector, about how that person was murdered. That is not the same in science as saying, I have a theory about how X and Y happens. So I advocate that in science teaching, we never use the word theory on its own. We always preface it with scientific. So we talk about scientific theory, scientific hypothesis, scientific fact, and scientific law. That way, we create that distinction between the vernacular use of those words and the specific scientific use of those words. I'd like to thank you for listening to me this morning. This is an important issue, I think, in science education. For many, many years when I tried to bring it up, I was told, oh, you're just creating a fuss about nothing. We don't have a problem here with creationism. Well, I think we have a growing problem with creationism here. I think the demotion of science from a core subject in primary schools to a subject which is not core is a backward step. We have to remember that over the years, creationism has moved incredibly towards evolution. They accept natural selection. They accept the generation of new species. Evolution has never moved one step towards creationism. It's only through a good science education can we maintain that. So I would urge you to support the campaign to bring about the teaching of evolution in primary schools. And I would urge you to support any notion whatsoever of the removal of creationism as anything akin to science. By all means, talk about it in the religious classroom. When I talk to my science teachers and they say, how do I deal with it when I have a person of faith in my class? I'm not here to try and destroy somebody's faith. I'm not here to try and convert them to becoming an atheist or an agnostic or anything else. And my answer is very, very simple. My answer is, science is about the acceptance of evidence. Faith is belief. And belief is often irrational and has no evidence. I don't talk about I believe in atoms or I believe in gravity, so it's a ridiculous thing to say I believe in evolution. I don't. I accept it because of the weight of evidence. I would urge your pupils, any parents, or anybody that you talk to who says evolution challenges my faith to say no, it does not. If it does, then gravity challenges your faith and atoms challenge your faith. Your faith is your faith. In science, we talk about the acceptance of evidence. Thank you very much.